welcome on behalf of the Oblate Community of St. Gertrude. I want to welcome you to this presentation. You'll learn a little about our community and what got us to where we are today, not in detail, but on the heart side of things. First of all, I would like to introduce Elise Cadez, who is my assistant. She is the helper to the lead coordinator, and she's going to kind of facilitate our welcome and our opening prayer. Elise?
Yes. Good afternoon. We're really pleased to have you here today. It's afternoon, I think, for everyone. By way of introduction, this presentation and next week's will be facilitated by our Oblate Community Triad Leadership Team, active members of St. Gertrude's Community and the Center for Benedictine Life. We partner with the Cenobitic Sisters. The lead coordinator is Jane Somerton. Debbie McCoy is the formation coordinator. Nadine Grady does connections as the coordinator, and myself, Elise Cadez, assistant. We'd like you to now ready yourself for an opening prayer. Just relax, have your feet flat on the floor, hands at your sides, perhaps palms down. Feel your connection with the earth. This beautiful spring and summer kind of weather that we're having here. Feel the energy of every living thing and rejoice. God is with us, but more. God is within us, giving us existence. Let us dwell for a moment on God's life, giving presence in our bodies, our minds, our hearts, and in the whole of our lives. And may this meeting time be one of benefit to all.
Thank you. So you may be wondering why the theme for our slides is images from a deep forest. And I want to share an analogy with you that I hope will help you understand our perspective of where we are today as Benedictines. Oblates make promises. This is not profession, but we have committed to long-term spiritual growth, to lifelong prayer, hospitality, study, and life in community as much as our life circumstances allow. As dispersed Benedictines affiliated with the Center for Benedictine Life at the Monastery of St. Gertrude, we are accountable for living and sharing the charisms of our Cenobitic community. Healing hospitality, grateful simplicity, creative peacemaking. This image of redwoods, and I'm losing my, okay. This image of redwoods illustrates the past, the present, and the future of our Benedictine community. At the base, you can see the horizontal fallen tree, sort of blending in with the rest of the earth. This is what I'm calling the ancestor tree. It's a nursery tree in the redwood forest. Our Benedictine ancestors who have courageously gone before us, creatively adapting to the changes in the world to address the needs of the people in their time. Ancestor tree is a solid foundation, rich with learning and soul nourishment, and a foundation for today's monasteries is where we come from, the rich history of Benedictine monasteries and people living the charisms of the rule of St. Benedict over the centuries. The large tree that you see coming from the nursery tree, with its roots wrapped around that nursery tree, it grew from this magnificent foundation. It was nurtured and it nurtures. I call this the sister tree. Our sisters at St. Gertrude's. You can see that the base is hollow. It is beginning to weaken, but is standing strong. It is firmly connected to the ancestors. These beautiful St. Gertrude's women who continue to transition and creatively look at ways to share the Benedictine life and Benedictine way outside of our monastery walls. That's what that tree represents to me. Our sisters who continue to guide and nurture us as they have for almost 140 years on the prairie in Cottonwood, and who are creatively transitioning into a new reality. Also growing from the ancestors' foundation, connected to and shadowed by the sister tree, is our oblate tree. We're smaller. We're going in a straight line, straight up. We don't have quite as many, haven't had quite as many adventures and interesting experiences as our sisters have, but we're right alongside with our roots and branches intertwined. We're smaller, we are committed, and we're growing. Together, we are all St. Gertrude's, every one of us. And hand in hand, we are walking each other home.
I'm Nadine, and I am going to spend a little bit of time describing our Oblate community, since it may be very different than the Oblate communities that you know. So I'm going to take a few moments on this slide. Today we are 99, mostly Oblates, but we have 4 novices and 9 inquirers at the moment. We are 8% male. We're 20% non-Roman Catholic, so pretty ecumenical. We have 9 area groups that meet monthly for prayer, lectio, and study. And this is really the core of our community. It's where we can get connected on a routine basis much more often than we're able to get together as a whole community. Those groups are scattered across Washington, Idaho, and into Western Montana. Plus, we have 8 remote members in other states. That's since the pandemic, we've been able to use technology to include those people in our meetings as well. From the beginning, we've had a close, active relationship with the monastery and the sisters. Our tradition has been to have 3 retreats on site at the monastery every year. Since the pandemic, that's now become 2 retreats that are hybrid, and Debbie will talk more about those later. We Oblates have almost always volunteered with chores while we're there for retreats, and sometimes for other tasks just to go volunteer and help. And they've always helped with the monastery's annual Raspberry Festival. We had Oblates that came up with the idea of the bed and breakfast inn at St. Gertrude's, which has been running successfully for a number of years now. And we even had an Oblate who served as general contractor for the remodeling of the residential wing during the pandemic. So you can see we're pretty closely connected with our monastery. This slide and the next one show a high-level overview of the work that our sisters and our Oblates have been engaged together over the past 35 years. So we've moved from being a small group, kind of spoon-fed by the sisters at the beginning, to being partners and companions in the mission to take Benedictine spirituality into the larger world of our families, workplaces, and neighborhoods. So back in '86, the sisters began considering an extended member program, and our first 8 members made their oblation in 1988. By 3 years later, there were 18 people, and they started meeting in area groups. And then all through the 90s, the Oblates, as the community grew, were helping the sister director. And the director changed from time to time, but the Oblates were helping, particularly with things concerning the retreats. In 2000, Sister Meg Sass formed our Oblate Council for communication and coordination between the area groups. And then by 2006, we made a big change. Before that, we'd always had one of the sisters as our director. In 2006, we switched to having a sister and an oblate who lives near the monastery, serving as co-coordinators. And they held that role for 14 years together. And that was the beginning of a lot of changes. In June of 2010, our retreat theme was Building on the Past, Creating the Future. And that one focused on building stronger personal connections between the Oblate and Cenobitic communities through sharing our vocation stories and what makes all of us Benedictines, and encouraging creative thinking about the future. That led to adopting formal vision and mission statements for the Oblate community in 2012. Those were modeled on the monastery's vision and mission statements. Starting in June of 2013, our Oblate area groups began to plan and lead some of our retreats. And in 2014, Sister Teresa gave a retreat on growth in community, which highlighted the idea that oblation is a vocation and drew us more toward more accountability and responsibility for our own formation. In 2017, we first saw that triangle presentation that Sister Teresa shared with you last week about we are all parts of the monastery and starting to get that new concept. In 2019 was the next big change in our leadership. That was when our Oblates started leading themselves. We no longer have a sister director. We have an Oblate leadership triad, of course, under the authority of the prioress and with sister that helps and guides us along the way. So we have, as Elise mentioned earlier, a lead coordinator, a formation coordinator, and a connections coordinator. And we'll talk more about that next week, how that leadership triad is working. Shortly after our first set of triad took their new offices, the pandemic struck. So they not only had a new job, they had a completely new situation to deal with. And during that time, like all of you, we learned about Zoom and how to conduct our meetings and our retreats remotely. We learned how to do remote oblation ceremonies. And we learned the most difficult job of all so far, conducting hybrid retreats with attendees both at the monastery and at home. So here we are in 2022-23, being the essential element of the new Center for Benedictine Life. The pandemic and the technology changed several things about our community's rhythm, and Debbie McCoy, our formation coordinator, will tell you about those.
Thank you. So in looking at the picture that we have here, we're looking at patterns, cadence, rhythm in our community. A pattern is the repeated or regular way in which something is done or occurs, which, as Nadine mentioned, changed quite a bit since we were named as leadership back in 2020. The cadence is the repeated patterns of our community, and the rhythm of life brings our legitimate needs, our deepest desires, and our unique talents into harmony with each other. We're aware of the fact that not all Oblate communities look alike or function in the same way. And so I'm just going to give you a short overview of what our rhythm has looked like in the past and a little bit about where we're headed. So as was mentioned earlier, our annual rhythm used to be that we would bring our community, our Oblate community, together 3 times each year. We were all at the time, most of us close enough that we could attend retreats at the monastery. So many of us would travel a couple of hours, some traveled further, but we were able to gather there regularly. And in the meantime, our local area communities are also continuing to meet monthly for prayer and study. So our spring retreat each year is generally held just after Easter. And it's been called the Discernment Retreat. We're now looking at it more as a commitment retreat. But the purpose of it, it's more of a contemplative time, allowing for novices and inquirers to prepare to make oblation, or for inquirers becoming novices. We've coined the term novation. It's a little faster, easier to say, but it's a time for people to kind of, their discernment has been ongoing, but that's the time for them to kind of bring it together for some commitment. During our retreats, we as an Oblate community share prayer in the chapel with the sisters. In our first evening, generally, we invite the sisters over and we have a social where all of us are together and spend time in community. And so in the spring retreat, the Sunday morning after morning prayer with the sisters, we hold the rite of oblation. And the prioress is in charge of leading that particular ceremony. All of our oblates would renew their oblations in chapel with the Cenobitic community present. And then at the time, the inquirers who were becoming novices, with that ceremony, that novation would take place at the retreat center called the Spirit Center. In June, there would be a retreat, which is oblates only, and that was a time to go deeper for those of us who have been oblates for some time. And we also usually left some time open to volunteer to help the sisters to complete tasks such as raking the cemetery or stuffing envelopes for mailings, or perhaps tasks in the kitchen. There's always something to be done in terms of canning, baking, etc. This retreat was generally smaller in number. And this is the retreat that you'll see as we continue that we're discontinuing. This was, we will not be continuing with the June retreat. And then every fall, we had a retreat that was open to all inquirers, novices, oblates. And many times we invited a retreat director to lead that retreat for us. It's essentially a formation focus in that fall retreat. And we had Judith Valente a couple of years ago. Sister Mary Foreman led us in a retreat on the Desert Mothers, many various retreat directors over the years. And as was mentioned earlier, about 2013, Oblates began planning and presenting our own retreats. So then in 2020, obviously, the pandemic forced us to make many changes. Zoom retreats were our very first attempt to gather as a community. And then once the retreat center, the Spirit Center, was able to reopen, we started to hold retreats in a hybrid fashion. This has actually allowed us to include members who would otherwise be unable to participate in the retreats. I have to say that Zoom has actually been one of the blessings of the pandemic. Even when we were meeting in person together at the monastery, not everyone was able to attend every retreat. And so there were times that might be 2 or 3 years before you would see a particular person if you weren't present at the same retreat. With Zoom, we have the opportunity to be present more often. Over the decades, our oblates and sisters together in this manner have developed such rich, deep relationships, and these are holding us in good stead as we move into the future together. And so this is more of a diagram of what our community rhythm looks like at the moment. And it's constantly changing, I will say. But so if we start with winter, We have an annual Oblate meeting, a winter edition Oblate newsletter. This is a fairly new thing that has come up, our Oblate newsletter. Obviously preparing for Lent. We participate with the prioress and the Cenobitic community with Bona Opera, Lenten prayer and practices, and our Oblate Council. During the pandemic, our representative council actually started to meet monthly via Zoom. Now we've sort of gone back to basically 4 times a year. So in spring, Lent continues, Easter, of course, our annual commitment retreat where those the discernment, oblations, novations take place. The spring edition of the Oblate newsletter is published, and again, an Oblate Council meeting. Summer is a quieter time, but we do have our annual leadership meeting, generally in August. The Raspberry Social is also in early August, the summer edition of the Oblate newsletter and the Oblate Council. And then in the fall, our annual formation retreat, the annual Oblate Memorial, and the fall edition of the Oblate newsletter is printed, and once again, the Oblate Council, leading us back into our winter rhythm. And again, all along the way, our local area groups are continuing to meet monthly, and we're actually struggling with how to name this new process because it isn't as if all of the groups are local anymore. There are a lot of members that are remote. The group in Montana is spread very far apart. And so even though they are all in Montana, they cannot generally gather all together. And so Zoom has really helped facilitate the growth of our communities and maintaining our relationships as we've gone through this. When we continue next week with this ongoing information about our Oblate leadership triad, we'll go into more detail regarding, I'll be going into more detail about formation and how these retreats figure into that.
So one of the things that we've been learning ourselves and that we would like to share with you is that we really are making something new at St. Gertrude's. And Teresa has walked with us for 15 plus years. And this is a quote that I saved from a retreat last fall that Teresa presented with us. We must learn to read the rule as modern people, as dispersed Benedictines who do not make vows. The rule is our guidebook, and we must learn to translate it into our modern lives. That is where my accountability for my transformation comes in. And like I said earlier in this presentation, we are walking together through this transformative process, and we're accountable for that. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had fruitful discussion. I know it was fast, but it seemed like it might be more productive for all of us if we have a little bit more time today for large group discussion. So I'm glad that you were able to touch base with each other, and we'll start by, remember last week, Teresa asked if people would share kind of what the tenor of your discussions were. So if you're willing to do that, you probably didn't designate anyone, but if there is a theme that came out of your conversation or some questions that you'd like us to address, we invite you to do so now. So maybe from group one.
Group one, there's probably somebody else who can talk.
Looks like most are still muted.
I don't know. This is Jeannie Weber, and I'm from Minnesota, from St. Benedict's in St. Joe, Minnesota. Our group, I don't know what number we were, so I didn't know how to respond. Anyway, we were one of the groups. There were 4 of us. There was a sister from Clyde, Missouri, a contemplative Benedictine group, myself, an oblate, and then 2 others, Anne and Christine, are one from Yakima and one from Missoula. So we were all over the map. Those 2 are not oblates, but they're very attached to St. Gertrude's and to the mission and the people, and it was lovely. And they feel called in their own special way, but not necessarily to be oblates, which was a little surprise to me. And then I mentioned our situation at St. Benedict's in Minnesota is we're a huge number. So there are over 400 oblates that are, actively on the rolls. Up to 700 get information. And then there are, I think, 157 sisters still at the monastery. And so we have a different problem. We can never be all together. I think our future is in having a unique style for each of the subgroups. They're not by geography now because of Zoom. We can be anywhere. Right. But that's about what we discussed.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Jeannie.
Jane, this is Mari Quint from Emmanuel Monastery in Lutherville, Baltimore, Maryland, and we were group 1. I told the group that I had just come from our monthly Oblate meeting, which was the first one in which the Oblate leadership team planned and executed the entire meeting. They invited one of the sisters to talk a little bit about something that needed to be said, but the rest of it was run by the leadership team completely. This is brand new for us. We've had a very strong leadership team for probably 20 years, but there's always been a sister who was the one who was in charge, in quotes. So what I said was, we have a very small monastery. There are 10 sisters and one who is permanently in healthcare. We have almost 4 times as many oblates, but we're dealing on our own scale with the future in a way that I'm listening to what's going on at St. Gertrude's with their Oblate community. These are issues that we are all facing, and I think that they are very important, and I'm so glad to have the opportunity to talk and listen with people from around North America.
Thank you, Mary. How about someone from group 2?
Well, there were only 2 of us. We didn't know how that, and then Carrie, she blacked out, but couldn't see her. But anyway, I think that what we shared was what was going on with the monasteries that we were part of. And like Jeannie Weber said, that I'm also a part of St. Ben's in Minnesota. And there's something unique about Jeannie Weber and myself in terms of we have quite a large group down in Minneapolis. And so this group meets once a month, and we have a little brunch together, and we read the Rule of St. Benedict, and we have prayer together. And then we always have we choose a book to read. It's not a book club, but we read the book in terms of what is it saying to our own lives. And we've chosen some books written by Benedictines. But I think it's so exciting and this hasn't happened yet up at St. Ben's, that the Oblates are taking leadership. And yes, there is a guide through the sisters or the prioress. I think that's just absolutely incredible because there's so many gifted women oblates. And, sometimes they're going by the wayside. And I did comment to Carrie, isn't it interesting that this is happening? And then in the church right now, that there's a strong talk about women becoming deacons. I mean, the tent is getting bigger and bigger. And so, it's not just the Benedictine Oblates, but other parts of the church as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Group 3.
We had a very, very interesting group of 5 of us. We had 2 sisters, sister from Clyde, from St. Placid, Missouri. We had an oblate of 2 years, Joanne, from Mount Angel, Oregon, and we had an inquirer, Brenda, from Bristow, Virginia. So I thought we had the whole gamut. And I suppose one of the things we appreciated very much was hearing about the long and thoughtful progression that has happened at Cottonwood. And personally, as a Good Samaritan sister from Australia who was present at the conference in 2019, we have benefited very much and learnt from the Cottonwood pattern and developments. And I'm pleased to relate that we have now elected our Oblate leadership team of 3, and one of those leaders is present on this Zoom this morning. It's the morning, it's the 1st of May in Australia. I suppose in talking about other groups, we're particularly interested in how the Oblates are doing the work and in Cottonwood, and how the growth is happening and being fostered. And the importance of the hybrid capacity and what a gift that is to us, the hybrid Zoom capacity. And how important this opportunity is for generating ideas. So gratitude very much, and acknowledgement of the influence far and wide of the Cottonwood community, Oblates and sisters together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Group 4.
Jeannie Weber reported on group 4. That was us.
Okay. Group 5.
To tell you the truth, I don't know which group I was in, but Sister Lumen, you were in group 5. All right.
Yep, I'm 5. Okay, so I'm Sister Lumen, and I am a missionary Benedictine currently in Sioux City, Iowa. There were 5 in our group. There were 3 sisters, and there's 1 oblate and 1 novice oblate. So we had a mix from Canada as well as Minnesota and then Iowa. So intentional action to set up this new community. We were all impressed with how Cottonwood's community is doing this, but also knowing the respective time given to set this up, looking at the number of years and the process of moving forward, moving ahead and together. Really appreciate that, and certainly appreciated the support, the feeling of connectedness. I think that came from your hybrid groups. I personally thought when you're talking about the leadership, now triad leadership being excellent, great ideas.
Thank you, sister. Group 6.
Well, that might have been my group. The one thing I would just like to add, maybe someone from my group has something else they want to add because we didn't assign a leader, but I think one point that was very interesting was as the groups were trying new leadership and more involvement with the Oblates, that the Oblates discovered, even though it was very exciting and very new and very interesting, they discovered that they didn't have the time they thought they had to make the commitment. So the commitment from the Oblates themselves is really a big deal. And while it's also interesting and forward moving, it still takes a lot of discernment about who would have really the time and the energy to do that. So I'm sure that you all have felt that, those of you who have been active in that. So that was one point from our group that I thought was worth mentioning. Thank you.
That's a really good point, Roseanne. And that is something that surprised the three of us when we were appointed in late 2019, about 2 or 3 months before the whole world shut down. We discovered that it was much more than what 3 people could do. And so we're actively implementing what we're calling kind of skilled layers of leadership. It's not hierarchical, it's very collaborative, but we are looking at the gifts of each person in the community and asking them. One of the questions that Teresa asked them at our retreat last fall was, what do you think your gifts are? What can you contribute? And some of the richest conversation at tables in that retreat that we've ever seen at any of our Oblate retreats. And then she asked the other folks at the table to affirm, well, yes, I do see that in you. So we're hoping this is part of the transformative process, right? The discernment of, okay, maybe physically I just don't have time this year, but I know I have these skills. So when and how can I contribute this at a level that is beneficial to the community? So we're being very flexible in this process and walking together and figuring it out as we go along. Group 7?
I think we were group 7. So if somebody in my group noticed that we were 7, that would be a nod. But anyway, I'll go. My name is Cammie, and I am from St. Paul's Monastery in St. Paul, Minnesota. And our group was a couple of sisters, a couple of oblates, and one person who I'm not sure if she was an oblate or not. But a rich conversation. We really appreciated the quote that kind of led into our discussions about allowing the rule to unfold for oblates. So just would love to hear more conversation around how people have seen that happen. We talked a little bit about how different monasteries were doing formation for oblates, as well as so initial formation as well as ongoing formation. Talked a little bit about how we appreciated how Cottonwood was so intentional with their seasonal retreats and what was when, and anyway, and then just some monasteries where the sisters are inviting oblates to their retreats as well. So that's a quick report.
Thank you. Group 8. Next week, I promise I'll ask you to somebody write down the number that you're in. Okay, how about group 9? No one knows what group they were in.
I'm Diane from Mount Angel oblates, and I'm just a candidate, but one of the major concerns was with the hybrid meetings. The woman who spoke first in the group was saying she was concerned that sometimes it seemed like Zoom maybe gives people more reason not to attend.
That, I think that's a valid concern. Mm-hmm.
Really, the conversation involved like in-person versus hybrid and the value that hybrid provided for groups that were dispersed and away from the monastery, but actually finding it more complex when the group could meet at the monastery but wasn't, and they weren't showing up on hybrid either. There was a kind of the challenge of accountability when there was too much convenience would maybe a way of summarizing it.
Okay, yeah, and those are valid concerns. I hear you absolutely. I think that may be a situation that we are dealing with a few folks, but I think it's a situation we've always dealt with in a way, because Cottonwood is in kind of a remote location. There aren't many people that live nearby, so we've always had to travel quite a distance to get there, most of us. And it's something I keep in the back of my mind. I watch. Part of it is knowing who our people are and understanding their lives and the challenges that they have. You may have noticed that we have an assistant to my role, and that's something that was recommended to us, and we'll go into this in more detail next week. But one of the things that I ask her to do is to reach out to folks that we haven't seen a while, a personal connection, and this is part of why Nadine's role is called Connections Coordinator. It's much more than administrative kinds of activities. It's a bigger concept. How do we stay connected in creative ways? And so that's something we really do think a lot about and focus on. But I do hear your concern there. Group 10.
Yeah, I guess I'll talk. One of our members is losing her voice, and so I'll jump in. We were pretty well distributed. We had an oblate from Australia, an interested person from Alaska, and I'm in near Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. I happen to be attached to St. Meinrad's Arch Abbey in Indiana. So we're pretty well dispersed all over. One of the things I can give a little bit of statistics, and that's what we were talking about. But for St. Meinrad, we have about 1,210 oblates, and about half of them are not attached to a particular chapter. And one of the things that we've done, I think it's been, including me, I'm about 2 hours away from the closest chapter, is Zoom. And that has been the question on there because, attendance is an important issue. And the person was talking about the people not wanting to go. We have weekly, we won't call them book reports, but we have discussions on a particular book. And then we have a monthly chapter meeting, and it's all virtually. And I would say about half the people, maybe even more, would not be able to get to a regular chapter meeting because in our particular virtual, there's Pennsylvania, California, Alaska, Florida. So that's all over. Now for the other, it's a little bit different in the smaller one for Australia and Anchorage, but also look at one of the common factors, I think, when we're looking at it, and this is one of the things that I'm curious about. We're discussing the fact that you sort of as you see the shift to more of the oblates taking over and doing more things. I don't even want to use the word taking over, but if you look at with the demographics of the various monasteries, the ratios are going that there are fewer people that have taken the vows versus those that are oblates. And we even see some of the things I hear stories about, sort of like the monks are stretched out because if they were to go, they've got long distances. And I think that's an issue that, when you were looking at it for St. Gertrude's, addressing the transition where just the demographics of the aging of the members in the monasteries, something that has to be dealt with, but also getting younger members that are going into becoming oblates. That's another problem as well.
Yes, that's true. Oblate communities are also aging. Group 10, group 11. Anyone?
I'm
We'll
in
forget
group
the
11.
groups.
I was in group 11.
Oh, good.
Also in group 11 were Jane, Margie, John, and Mary. And maybe one of them would like to speak since I'm not directly involved with oblates. So anybody?
Yeah, I can say just a few words. We had a good discussion, noticing particularly that the impetus for the more substantial connection between the oblates and the sisters came from the sisters, and so that seems important to note that we're not there to batter down anybody's doors. But we are called to prayer, so that may be the thing. But just amazed at all the organization and the time that's taken to develop over the years. But the shared leadership and the gradual movement from that is remarkable. And it seems like all of this is tailored to the individual monasteries and their composition and what their needs are, as well as the oblate community. So lots of good tracks to run on and a need to, be aware of the local situation.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I can't remember the name of our group or the number of our group, but we had one sister, two oblates, and an inquirer. And most of the discussion, probably because I'm a pushy speaker, focused on our circumstances at Mount Angel, Oregon, where I am the coordinator of Oblates, the lay coordinator, and part of an 11-person leadership team and council. And for us, there's a dilemma that we're facing that's not unique, but is certainly immediate, and that is that our monastery is right now coming to the completion of its mission, and the final one of our sisters will be moving into assisted living at the end of May. And so we are, and have been for the last couple of years, really taking a look at what happens to the oblate community when the monastery is no longer there. And we set several goals in our oblate council retreat last summer. And the first of those was to maintain connection and continuity with the sisters in their new living situation. The second was to sustain and grow our own community, our own oblate community. And the third was to establish connections with a wider oblate, Benedictine and oblate world. And we feel like we're making pretty good progress, but we're all clinging to a life raft right now, in a sense, because our mothership is gone or will be gone shortly, which will take away a place for us to meet in a fairly concrete period of time, and many, many other changes as well. We have already long been working the hybrid process. We started Zoom, and we Zoomed all through the pandemic and have been doing hybrid since we were able to meet back together in person. We have local reflection circles that
do Lexio and reading and prayer and community together, including a Zoom one. And we're hoping to keep building on the kinds of things that St. Gertrude's is doing to sustain our community, especially over the period of grief and loss and uncertainty that we're in the midst of right now.
Oh, Mary, that story makes me so sad. I live in Oregon and I would love to come visit you. We can touch base after, okay?
Oh, yes, let's do.
Okay. I think, I'm hearing a lot of things, and what I want to emphasize at St. Gertrude is that we are making something new slide, because that is what we're doing. And so there are many things going on that are helping that to happen. But we aren't retrofitting who we were and what we were into something that's been around for 100 years. We are looking at something really new. So, and I'm not sure how to articulate that. Hopefully I'll have some better words next week. Are there comments from anyone else?
Our discussion in group 14, there was just two of us. And Suzanne from Mount Angel was talking about St. Francis and the medieval period where the world is our cloister, and the development of the Franciscan third order. And so it's exciting that this is new, but then that there are past examples which we can also look at, because all of the monasteries started have a history where they started and how they came together and how they were called to their vocation, whether it's oblate or sister or inquirer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I was part of group 13, and there were 3 of us. And one of the stories that came out is that one person was from Arizona and one person, myself, from New Mexico, and then another person, I think, from Missouri. And one of the things about the Southwest is there are very few monasteries. And the monastery, the person in Arizona was affiliated with, closed in Tucson. And yet they kept a group of oblates in Phoenix who used to be attached there. And what I became aware of as she was talking is that there is no way to know where there are oblate groups that are not affiliated with a monastery. And that obviously they're affiliated with Clive, Missouri, but they're in Arizona. And there are other groups like that. And I've been frustrated as I've been trying to discern whether I want to be an oblate about finding oblate groups. And I realized that this is a communication issue as well as a national issue. And I love Cottonwood and do classes there. And thank you, Sister Teresa Jackson, because you've been a saint. But I just feel like we could have more information shared about where to go, how to find people. I mean, I am sure that in Albuquerque, there are other Benedictine oblates, but I don't know how to find them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There's no way for me to know. So I'm just putting it out there that I think all of this newness has to be built on community. And if community is not solid, then that's the root of your tree. And so I really want to encourage you to start figuring out, how do we communicate so everyone knows where we can connect with an oblate community? Thank you.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you, Jan.
I could add something to that, because when I was looking to, was interested in being an oblate, but my question was like, where? And I sort of started at top down. I can't remember the website, but if you look at the one where you've got for the Benedictines and the different congregations that make it up worldwide, I started looking at that. Then I started to look to see, first looking close to me in Pennsylvania, and then I started looking down to see what they had as far as the oblate numbers. And then I would go to that particular monastery and see where most of them will say where they have oblate communities. So it's drilling down that way to get to it, because it's difficult, I think, to try to get it just from here's an oblate where they go. It's really based on the particular monastery or the congregation that you're going to, because like St. Meinrad is part of the Swiss American. There's another one that's actually closer to me in Newark, New Jersey, or near Montclair, and that's part of a different one that their abbey is attached to, one in Buffalo. So you almost have to go down and start looking at it and play the through the internet and do a little bit, because even then, once you found one that may be close by, that may not be the one you want to go to. You've got to get a feeling of, do I fit in? So when I looked at all these things, I felt I fit in closer to St. Meinrad, even though there were closer ones to me. And so it's hard to just say you want a community. It's a community that you feel part of. And that doesn't give you an easy answer, but there is a way that you can go about it. It's just, it takes time.
I hear you and I understand that, but I will tell you that I have found that there are monasteries that you can't locate on the internet. Pat Pickett, who's from St. Ben's, who lives in Tennessee, and I have had multiple conversations about this as we have tried to track down different monasteries and who they are and who's there. And it's a very complex system, because some are not Roman Catholic, some are ecumenical, and yet some that are ecumenical have sisters that are Roman Catholic. It is very complex. So, in order to create community, I think we need to at least know who's where and what they're doing. Sounds pretty simplistic, but I don't think it is. Thank you. I'll stop.
Thanks, Jan.
I'll go and add on to that. One of the problems you'll see, as far as not finding it, is the fact that you'll discover that monasteries have closed down. And I'll give one example. I think it's Blue Cloud. I always get it. It's in North Dakota, and it faced part of the problems that the other, I think in Oregon, where it's aging and their mission has changed. What's happened is the monastery closed. We just recently in St. Meinrad, they moved their one. They were still part of it. Blue Cloud was originally founded by from St. Meinrad, but they moved to become part of St. Meinrad. So yeah, you can actually search on the internet. You'll find a lot of places where there's broken links and such, simply because the monasteries have disappeared, and that's sad in and of itself.
It is sad. I think we're in a time period that is challenging us to look at Benedictine life in different ways and in new ways. And it may not mean that there will be a monastery for all people to be connected to. It may mean that groups of, and this is just me postulating, which I do, that groups of like-minded, good-souled people who want to follow the Benedictine way find each other. And there are some ways that they can be accountable and responsible for their own formation together with assistance from someone else or some other resource. This is where the world is wide open right now. And so I guess I won't go any farther with that. We have about 12 more minutes of time for conversation. Is there any more input from participants?
Okay. Jane, I'm just wondering, there's the 4th Federation of Benedictine Sisters, and each federation would probably know their oblates. So that would be one way of doing it.
Right.
I mean, I would think that the president of the federations would know, or would able to direct them to the different monasteries.
And this isn't the first time that someone has expressed concern about how difficult it is. In the Benedictine, what is that called? Being Benedictine conversations that were hosted by Erie, similar concerns. How do we find each other? How do we share information? So, there should be, I suppose, a Benedictine network. Anyone with interest in that could certainly step up and help make it happen. But how isn't something that we know.
Jane, I see a hand up. There's a sister that has a hand up.
Yes. Sister Marie Victoria.
Hi. Yes. I was going to speak to that. Even in your presentation, you mentioned about creating a newsletter. And I know our Oblate director does that as well. And that's a form of communication and of invitation. And as I'm looking around in the screen, I think I'm safe to say that I'm one of the youngest ones here and professed. And one of the other things that I do is I also help communities who are struggling with that decision of where is God calling us now? And one of the things I would like to invite you all to think about is what gave you the spark in the beginning to join your community as an oblate? What was it about the Benedictine way of life that drew you? And how may you enliven others who are seeking possibly to give witness, just like you have and are doing?
Thank you for that, Sister Maria. If I can follow up with a question, to be an oblate, it does require a monastery, right? So you couldn't find a group of people who were interested, passionate about the rule, and say we will be oblates.
Right.
Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, because I was a part of also the Being Benedictine from the very beginning, as to what they were trying to say was, even though you may not have a physical monastery next to you, there's ways of communicating. Like for our community, we do a lot via Zoom. And while, yes, it would be nice to be in person, there might just be other ways, avenues that are opening up doors to us. And we might need to revision how we see that in the future in our own circumstances.
I'll echo that, Maria. I think to respond to your question, Mary, that's where St. Gertrude's is looking at new ways of being Benedictine. So not everyone will be called to oblation, to an affiliation with a community in that manner. There may be other ways, and that we are looking at that. As
to add a little bit to the conversation here, our community is very small, and several of us are fragile, and so we realized some while back, at least our prioress, who is also the director with some oblates of our oblate group, came to the conclusion that they could no longer continue, and we put it out there, and some other people have taken up the torch, but they're also in the same position of being elderly and not able to continue. And we will be meeting in a couple of weeks to sort of fish out what we might be able to do or how we might be able to proceed. But in the meanwhile, the business of having to have a monastery to be an oblate, as we no longer can provide that kind of, I suppose, leadership, we changed the name. So our group is now not Oblates of our community anymore. They are Friends of Benedict. We call ourselves the FOBs. The FOBs, they're the key things, they open doors, they open your cars, they open your elevators, they open everything.
Oh, the FOBs, that's great.
And the Oblates are still there, and they're geographical. Small geographical groups. So if that's helpful, I just throw that into the conversation.
That's a creative way to look at how can we continue to make this work. And what it does too is imply that leadership will be assumed by the FOBs more and more as you go forward, right? Thank you, Valerie.
If I could add just a couple of things. Probably about 8 or so years ago, the American Benedictine Academy had a session called Keeping Death Daily Before Your Eyes. And one of those sessions dealt quite extensively with the completion of communities, but also of the transfer or whatever of oblates to either new communities or finding new ways of gathering together. I know that one of our oblates was at one point the director of some of probably 3 different oblate communities that had just found each other and gathered together. There is a Facebook page. I don't know how current it is or whether it's still up and running, but there is an oblate page out there that might be a way of finding another nearby oblate.
And I would like to quickly add that I really like the idea that Sister Maria Victoria had about sharing the Oblate newsletter. I get the newsletter from St. Gertrude's, which is very valuable to me. I not only learn what's going on at St. Gertrude's, but there's always a wonderful, informative, instructive piece from the prioress and articles about other sisters at the monastery. And also, Jane, you said not everyone will be an oblate, and Valerie I think worded it Friends of Benedict, and that makes me very hopeful that there's a place for me, because I don't see myself being an oblate. But yeah, what a wonderful conversation this has been.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Jane?
I'm wondering about the organization referred to as NABOD, the North American Association of Benedictine Oblate Directors. I looked that up online and I couldn't tell if they were current, and it looked like the last newsletter or information they had put out hadn't been since 2020 or 2021. Do you have any information? Are they still viable?
Maybe Sister Teresa can answer that. I don't know because I haven't been in, I've been to a couple of meetings, but I'm not sure what their current status is.
Sure. They have been very active. They used to have every couple of years a, retreat, usually for directors, not just oblates. I think with diminishment with COVID, the sister who runs it simply doesn't have quite as much, time, resources to put into it. But she's also the one that sent out, the information about this whole series to her whole list of oblate directors. So they're not as robust as they used to be, but they're still a good contact.
Okay, thank you. Good to see you.
Okay, well, we have reached almost our 1.5 hour time frame. I will let Elise, thank you everyone, first of all, for the wonderful conversation. And I anticipate we'll have another one next week. Elise, we will leave it to you now to wrap us up.
So by way of a closing prayer, again, please relax. Feet flat on the floor, good, be in touch with Mother Earth. Spirit of God, be with us in good times and bad. Give us the words we need, the courage we crave, the trust that will lead us all together through life's challenges and changes. Amen.
Amen. And we'll see everyone next week. Thank you again for your contributions and stay open-minded.